Good afternoon for this final session of the day. And we've had sort of a keynote, we've had a policy panel, and we've already had one session with 3 academic papers. And now we have a final session with a further 3 papers. And thank you for coming back. I should also say that there's a large delegation has just come in as also from the International Council on Environmental Economics and Development. So welcome to all of you who've just come in listening to the final 3 papers. So we're starting half an hour late, and therefore we also finish half an hour late with your permission. But I also hope that we're not going to overrun. So one message is to make sure that we got the balance right. And on the one hand, we do want to listen and hear all the fantastic new results of the papers, but at the same time, I don't think we should overrun. So I remember seeing Tola doing a job, basically having to tell everyone to stop talking. I hope we can just make sure that we tell your key messages up front, I would say, and then stick to the time allocation. I'm really looking forward to that. So it's 20 minutes for presentation max, and then 5 minutes for discussions, and then 5 minutes for time for about 2 or 3 questions. Now, the first paper, let's turn to the first paper. I understand that the title has changed, so let me just say the title correctly. So it's going to be on connectivity and its effects on interest rates and traded volumes in the Kenyan overnight interbank market. And it's a paper by Pierre Weiss, by Victor Morinde, and Chris Green. So over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. And I'm very, very sorry to my discussant, because this is very much a work in progress. It changed basically every week. So the version I'm presenting now is not the version that my discussant got. And that is why I have to apologize to him. But this is research, and this is how it goes. So what is this all about? It is not specifically tailored to China or China-African relationships. It is about relationship banking and the state of banking in an emerging market. And I think it is still a subject that is vastly under-researched. And I cannot but point out how important it is, because in my personal view, nothing to do with science, it's just my personal view, most of the industrialized countries had their formative years hundreds of years ago. So which kind of guidance should we give emerging markets or emerging countries in their financial markets, and how to structure that? We don't know, because back then we didn't have researchers to actually document everything. Yeah, so we are in a very peculiar situation where we have emerging markets on the one hand side, we have industrialized countries on the other side, but the struggles that emerging markets have is something that industrialized countries actually don't really understand. They haven't been researched very well, and therefore it is very, very, very important that we look into it, especially also in connection to which lessons can we actually learn from industrialized countries, and where do we need to be very, very, very careful in just transmitting these things. So I think that is not actually full size. Let's try this one. Okay, so I was told to be very brave. So that was just the motivation I basically told you. So interbank markets are very important, a channel to stabilize financial markets. In general, in the financial literature, it has been apparent, again, mostly in industrialized countries, that long-standing relationships are beneficial, potentially reducing asymmetric information. So you would give a loan to another bank because you know they are good for it, even though the rest of the market wouldn't necessarily agree. But you do that because you have a history with that bank. So that's at least what the rationale is. And then on the other hand, we have the last 10 years or so, we have network measures that kind of capture the structure of financial markets. And they are incredibly rich. And again, all the network literature came originally not from finance people. They came from engineering. You wouldn't believe it. But that also means that some of the network measures haven't actually been tailored towards the financial institutions. So, but that has been going on, and they have been shown that network measures actually affect interest rates and transaction volume. And we want to basically combine both. We want to have, on the one hand side, something like long-standing relationships, and on the other, we want to have the network measures to capture as much as possible. We have an incredibly rich but old data source. A unique data set that covers 2003 to 2012. It identifies source, target volume, and interest rate of altogether 50 banks, but not all of the 50 banks are actually active all the time. Some emerged later, others closed, etc., etc., etc. We also have bank characteristics like size, location of headquarters, and ownership. So size, large, medium, and small. We have location, foreign and local, and we have ownership, listed and private. Here is the distribution, and unfortunately, as you can see here, we have only 8 large banks classified as large, which are not actually trading every day and all the time. And that is also one reason why we shied away from interacting with size, location, and ownership, because we would basically over-identify. So it would be driven by 1 or 2 large banks, the effect of large bank plus something else, and that's not good practice. So we shied away from that. We identified in a different paper 6 liquidity shocks, and we took that opportunity to basically see how an emerging market actually deals with these liquidity shocks. So this is Kenjin IPO, the post-election crisis, Safaricom IPO, then the general financial crisis, and the last 2 we merged together because they are kind of overlapping. So we only used 1 dummy variable to represent both. So it's Kenjin infrastructure bond issuance and infrastructure bond issuance. So we are using those 6 shock periods, and up there you have also the subsamples. We have pre-shock, we have shock, and we have post-shock. And we are looking into how the interest rates and how volume is affected by long-standing relationships and network measures, individual network measures. So the data, because we have a source, we have a target, we have an interest rate, and we have a volume, it is a natural directed network. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how familiar you are with network structures and all of that. So very, very, very brave. We have altogether 2,180 days. You can see the breakdown in pre-shock, shock, and post-shock period. So N bar is basically the average number of firms, banks that are engaging in these periods. That is about 30. Then you see in the shock period a rise, and then post-shock goes down again. E bar, third from the bottom, is the number of transactions, basically. And before we have 60, then a very sharp rise. We have 144, and then basically it goes down again almost to its previous level. So these are the aggregate kind of stuff. Now we come to the meat, basically, of that paper, and that means long-standing relationships. everyone has basically struggled to define relationship banking. There is no just one definition that exists. We found that incredible paper, Kobayashi and Takaguchi, who basically take a model and say, okay, we model the probability that bank A is a lender and bank B is a borrower. And this is represented here by UI towards J. So what it says is we have an activity level for the outgoing bank, for the lender, and we have an activity level for the borrower. And together, they actually determine the probability of actually meeting and transacting if, and that is important, if they do not have preferences for a specific bank. Yeah, and I use that model in order to then define two very important measures. First of all, significant ties, which basically means that the lender and the borrower have a significant trade significantly more often than the model predicts, and that is at the 1% level. And just to throw that out of the way, we tested the influence on the 1%, 5%, and 10% level, looks all more or less the same, and as one would expect. So it's a significant tie is always bound to a specific pair. It always needs to be a lender and a borrower. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we also have relationship banking. So RB is short for relationship banking. And relationship banking is actually specific in their notation and in their connotation for a specific bank. So it's not any longer a pair, a lender and a borrower. It is how a bank is acting, how they are behaving. So we have relationship banking, and they are classifying a bank engaging in relationship banking if it has significantly fewer partners than the model would predict. So, and therefore, you see already that significant ties and relationship banking is kind of connected in a reverse relationship. Yeah, because on the right-hand side, we see bank one is a borrower. And this is made up. This is not a true representation of anything, but it's just for illustrative purposes. So we can see that we have 3 connections incoming from bank 2. So we would say that this is probably a significant tie that 1 and 2 are forming. And then you have a lot of others. And presumably, other than this one bank 2, they have no preference for any other bank. Okay, so on the left-hand side, what you see is basically the same number of total connections, but bank 1 here has a significant tie with bank 2, 3, and 4. And because it deals with significantly less partners or fewer partners, we would classify the left picture as one doing relationship borrowing. Of course, we could draw the pictures the other way around, where we have outgoing errors, and then we would have the complement pictures for significant ties and relationship lending. Okay. So we are calculating that always over a window of 12 consecutive days. And they are basically dummy variables for these consecutive within this 12-day window. Again, we did our robustness checks, and we actually determined that the 12-day window gives us the most stable network. So if we are going too short, then everything is up in the air, and it's all too volatile to actually have relationship ties and significant ties, relationship banking and significant ties that are reliable as a measure. If it is too long, it becomes unreliable as well. So we actually optimized, and the 12-day window is optimal for this network in that time. Okay, So, and the network measures are calculated over a network spanning the same 12-day window. Now, to the network measures. The network as such actually reflects the relative liquidity needs and abundances, and also therefore already incorporates the preferences for particular partners. So that is a manifestation of whatever is going on, the myriad decisions banks are doing. Therefore, we believe that that as with significant ties and relationship banking, they measure something similar. They are correlated, but the correlation coefficients and covariance coefficients are actually rather low. So this is also an indication that although they measure similar things, they are still distinct enough to not have a high correlation coefficient. So in particular, we use network, the weighted out-degree centrality clustering coefficient, and the CAT centrality. All of the networks are actually widely used. And yes, I need to jump now to the results we have. If you want to know more about how this all works, yeah, ask me directly now over the dinner or tomorrow, or I send you happily the paper once it's finished. So here are just clustering efficient, low clustering, high clustering coefficient, CAT centrality, and all of that. Here very shortly, and that's kind of important, the upper one shows the spread of the volume weighted interest rates, and I had to cut it from below and above, because as you see in the post-shock period, the furthest to the right, it goes out of all bounds. So it's getting crazy. So I had to narrow it in. But what you see is that there seemed to be a little bit of a difference depending on which period you are in. With volume, here the log of the bilateral volume is much easier. You can see that mostly if banks have significant ties, they are actually borrowing more heavily. And if they have no significant ties, the volume tends to be lower. We can do that for relationship lending and relationship borrowing as well. So here we have relationship lending. And again, in a post-shock period, it just goes wild. So what we learned over time is that this post-shock period, something's going on there, which we cannot fully explain. It's really weird, and I would love to have to study that a bit more. Again, if we have a bank that is engaging in relationship lending, the volume is higher. But this is not altogether astounding, because if you have fewer partners, each of the transactions you do tend to be higher. So same thing for relationship borrowing. Again, not really, as far as volume goes, not really astonishing. If you have fewer partners, volume tends to be higher. Okay, now we did random effects panel estimation. We had to do the 3 periods separately because they are just too distinct to merge them all together. And it has its reasons, because let's go there for illustrative purposes only. So we have data set from 2003, and we can see in other graphs that from 2003 onwards, they were finding their feet. So pretty much the pre-shock period is the one where they got actually to know how the market works and all of that. Then we have the shock period, and then we have the post-shock period. And as you see, post-shock period, totally different. Shock period also totally different, because almost all banks are trading all the time and with everyone who lends their money. The liquidity needs are partially so high. So therefore, we had to separately estimate that. And here are the results for the spread of bilateral volume weighted rates. We included here the log of the bilateral volume as well, because eventually you want to do a simultaneous equation estimation. So we included that here already. By and large, what we see is when you go through all of that, and there I skip ahead, that subperiods are very different. Relationship banking and networks have predominantly negative effects on the volume weighted rates. The interaction terms, on the other hand, have mostly positive effects for lenders and still a negative for borrowers, which basically comes down to better connected lenders and borrowers are engaging in relationship banking and get therefore more favorable rates. Okay, so quickly to volume. A more coherent picture on the volume, sorry. The bilateral volume is generally higher when the pair forms significant ties. So there seems to be a bit of a history indeed. So if you form significant ties, trust does not necessarily manifest itself in the interest rate, but it does in the volume. Relationship lending and borrowing leads generally to higher transaction volume. And interestingly enough, the CAT's weighted degree centrality leads to higher transaction volume, but not clustering. So that's a bit puzzling. We need to look into that a little bit more. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I stayed in 20 minutes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Peer, for that really interesting presentation. And could I start by following up on what she said at the beginning of the presentation on the importance of this work? Because I have some practical experience myself. And it's now the case that many central banks in Africa are implementing inflation targeting monetary policy, in which they target a policy interest rate. And they do that through the interbank market, because in Africa, the interbank market is practically the only money market. And as I know from my own experience in Uganda, the central bank monitors the interbank rate every day in order to determine whether or not it intervenes in the interbank market through its repos or reverse repos to implement its monetary policy. So understanding how these rates are being determined in the interbank market is incredibly important from the point of view of central banking. From my comments on the paper, I'll be briefly just 3 or 4. The first comment I would make is that there are various measures of connectedness and relatedness. And as Professor Peer said, the profession struggle to really understand and adopt these into research. I think it would be very useful if the paper could include a comprehensive discussion of these various measures of connectiveness and how they relate to each other and what they are actually signifying. The second point I would make is that, I mean, clearly you have a good data set from the Central Bank of Kenya, but there may be other things which are influencing the interbank rates that are not in that data set. For example, the actual financial soundness of particular banks. It will be good, if possible, and I don't know whether it is possible, if you could include some of those measures. That might be asking too much, because I'm not sure that data would be available to you. You would certainly have to get it from the central bank, and it would not be available on a high frequency. But something which I think might be available would be, and which would possibly affect the interest rates and the volumes, would be access of each of these banks to the Lombard facilities or the CBK. Because it's undoubtedly, I think that many of the banks will have borrowed during this period, from the CBK, either because they've not been able to borrow in the interbank market. And that surely would have been reflected in the rates or the volume which they are borrowing at. So maybe you should be controlling for that. And then lastly, I think that, I mean, you've pointed out these huge differences, it appears, in the three periods, particularly between the period of the 6 liquidity shocks and the subsequent period. It would be really interesting if we could have more understanding of why these changes have happened. And will it be the case if there are further liquidity shocks? Will the behavior of volumes and interest rates revert back to what we saw in that period? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was very succinct as well. 3 to 4 comments there by Dr. Martin Brownbridge. So thanks very much, Professor Weiss. Let me just open the floor basically for any comments that you may have and questions that may arise, and then we can ask the professor and maybe the co-authors to address any of the questions. So the lady over there, would you like to go first?
Thank you. It's just a question of curiosity. I'd like to know if there are some papers that have been made on a similar topic on a developed country, and if yes, is your result different from the one found? Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to, lady there?
Yeah, it's just a quick comment. I think when we're talking about relational lending, we can refer to the network literature, because there are lots of work in terms of how to quantify the different nodes, and also the structurals, and also the power asymmetry among the different actors in the network. That could be some reference for building up your analysis.
And Abi.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm not an expert in this area, but I like the agent-based modeling, which is usually used in this type of network analysis. The question I have is whether you have uncovered any dynamic behaviors that emerge from the interactions of banks. And I want to reinforce a point made by the central bank, because bank interventions or regulatory interventions will have important implications. Therefore, it is good to see how any liquidity injection, whether it leads to stabilization or destabilization.
Okay, thank you so much. Unless anybody else, I'd like to ask you to address these questions. I was also wondering, in the China-Africa context, if there is any relation there. So you may want to address it or not at all. But so the question, or the comment from Martin, and the other questions, over to you.
Yeah, there bits and pieces are there for developed countries as well. Certainly the effect that relationship banking has, or the other way around, I'm sorry, that network effects have on the volume, that they are more clear, that's the same. Unfortunately, or fortunately for developed countries, they are much more stable. So we don't have these clear delineated periods. So they could estimate everything in one model and just use dummy variables for shock periods. Yeah, that's not possible here. And that is one of the messages I want actually to give, to say, look, we cannot expect an emerging country to come with an overnight interbank market, fully structured, fully consistent and mature and everything. That won't happen. You will have clear periods of building up, restructuring, because, and as somebody else actually pointed out as well, they will be impacted by wider macroeconomic effects. Yeah, whatever else goes on in the rest of the country and in the rest of the economy will impact on the interest rates. So my guess is that in the post-shock period, what we saw as that upheaval with the large amplitude changes, there is some macroeconomic effect that we haven't accounted for. Yeah, that will probably explain it. I don't know. We haven't looked into it. With network, we have extensively looked into network measures. They were the most straightforward connected to the issue we wanted to study. And dynamics, I would love to do that. It's a bit difficult with such a huge data set, but I would love to do it. Haven't done so far. Connection to China. Well, I think we all should be very, very, very interested in all of the emerging markets having a vibrant, stable financial market. And every study that can actually contribute to our understanding how we get there should be welcome.
Very good. Thanks so much for your paper. Really interesting. And also very well done on time as well. So we're looking forward to reading more of your paper when the final iterations have been done. Now let's go to the next paper. So the next paper is a paper by Dr. Frangton Chiyemura from the Open University. And it's a paper on the politics of knowledge production around China-Africa relations.
I hope everyone can see me because I'm very tall. Well, thanks everyone. And thanks for the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I'm going to talk about a topic that is not so much related to all the presentation you've had since morning, but I think it's a topic that is important, especially the age we are in, and also because we are at SOAS. So my presentation really is going to invite you to think with me, but also hopefully by the end of it, you also ask questions that I'm asking. So what we are interested in this paper particularly is to understand political economy of knowledge production around China-Africa relations. And in simple terms, basically it's asking questions about who is publishing work on China-Africa, where is this work published, who is funding this kind of work, and who is leading or who are the leading authors or voices in this area, and what are the political implications of this. This is basically what the paper is all about. So in terms of the outline there, I'll try to give you the scope, which I've already done. And then I think we also need to take into consideration a justification of why focusing on this particular issue is important. And then I'll try to do a bit of some kind of conceptual framing around politics of knowledge production, and then a bit of current discourses or discussions around China-Africa knowledge production, a bit of reflection on data and methods, and then a bit of preliminary results, because this is still much work in progress, and a bit of consideration here and there. So I would really appreciate if you've got sets of questions, comments, and suggestions, please, if you can share those with me at the end of the presentation, I would really appreciate that. So I think we all know that since the 2000s, the relationship between Africa and China has proliferated. And because of that, we also see kind of multiplication of narratives and discourses around this relationship. And some of these really have kind of started raising important questions around what shapes these narratives around thinking about China and Africa and how these relationships plays out on the ground. We have seen what we call 3 scholarship camps emerging. The first one really taking a Chinese-driven analysis, where in most cases scholars are saying the reason between China and Africa relations is happening at the time is because China is kind of driving this. But then we've also seen what we call the African Agents 10, which is basically scholarship challenging the assumption that China is driving this relationship, rather looking at how Africans are also kind of driving the way they're engaging with China. And then we have more of a pragmatic approach to this, which is try to understand how these relationships are co-driven or co-determined. I think what is important is that as production of knowledge continues, or the relationship continues to grow, questions around knowledge production will start to emerge as well. And I think it takes us to this stage where we need to start ask this question. My assumption is that proliferation of relationship between China and Africa also correlates with increased production of knowledge, although some of which really, as some of kind of emerging scholars are saying, kind of mirrors imperial meta-narrative that in most cases kind of bypass local perspectives and narratives around China-Africa relations. And linked to this, there's also an argument around how power and location particularly shape these knowledge production processes. Here we are looking at the location of these people who are producing these knowledges and how their location somehow affect the way they look at the relationship between China and Africa. And an interesting quotation here coming from Christopher Lee saying that the way we currently understand mostly China-Africa relations is in most cases mirrored by how Europe had relationship with Africa. So there's this idea of colonial past as kind of an angle through which we should be analyzing or looking at China and Africa. After our literature review, we actually realized that although there's so much scholarship looking at China and Africa, ranging from finance and some of the topics that you have had so far, we haven't really found any kind of meaningful discussion around politics of knowledge production. And because of this, we are interested in understanding politics of knowledge production here, understood as who is publishing, in what format this work is publishing, where is it publishing, who is funding this research, and what are the political implications of this. It really matters because I think we all acknowledge that knowledge production is inherently political. So there are kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and to some extent, kind of ideological reasons why certain types of knowledges are produced, under what circumstances, and when do these knowledges actually become public or are released into public domains. So I think it is important that we need to engage with this. So it is also important because I think we try to respond to some of kind of earlier discussion from scholars who are saying that if we fail to understand how there are political drivers influencing this, chances are we may also fail to understand how certain forms of knowledge operate and are disseminated within certain political trajectories. I think, as I said earlier on, it matters because somehow the way we understand the China and Africa relation is basically a product of what we consume, all right? The media, the newspapers that we read, but then we need to understand how that is influenced by these political dynamics and how then it influences our perceptions, for instance, around risk. Here we are talking about risk and financing, stuff like that, but also things about policy decision within given trajectories or areas, and also investment choices and public perceptions and opinions around this. I think having an understanding of these political drivers of knowledge production, it kind of help us bypass some of kind of these limited Western perspectives and try to kind of cultivate an inclusive and more collaborative effort in producing a knowledge, with the idea of recognizing that there are different voices and there are different perspectives really around Africa-China relations. In terms of how we frame this, we kind of draw on existing work from Alatas, who talks about this idea of intellectual imperialism. And we try to also make use of this in our own work, where we kind of understand this idea of intellectual imperialism as a process of domination, or the idea of domination by one people in their world of thinking and also in their kind of a world of knowing. And then try to understand what are the political implications of intellectual imperialism. So we do so by actually, as I said earlier on, questioning the research outputs, where they are published, and whose ideas and information contained in these works has the ability to influence the knowledge production of other countries, simply because they tend to be, if you want, cited more, or they are more influential, and then what then that would imply for those areas where they also have their own forms of knowledge productions. What we do, we review work which was published between 2010 and 2023 around China-Africa relations, and we do use Scopus here as our database. Of course, there are so many other databases that could be used, like Google, Web of Science, Dimensions, etc. But I think we chose Scopus because of At the moment, I think they tend to have a wide coverage around this topic, but also they tend to standardize the way they do their bibliometrics collection. So for instance, they do mention who's funding this research, institutional affiliation of authors, and the types in which this document, in this research is published. It could be books, book chapters, articles, and review articles, etc. And of course, we understand that there could be some limitations around using Scopus, but I think for now, this is the one we are going for, because as I said, it standardized the way they collect their bibliometrics. In terms of the contemporary discourses, I'm sure probably you're all aware of this, how the West in most cases is seen as the center of knowledge production. And I think this goes back in time to even Renaissance period. Of course, things are changing, but still we have an assumption that good research or good publication really comes from the West. And because of this, I think Alat has tried to challenge this, saying that it's not always the case that certain people or certain places have this kind of knowledge production hegemony in terms of challenging or in terms of influencing how certain people think. We need to think about how do we go about this in informing these discourses from our own worldviews. So he kind of talks of this idea that this idea of domination is not only a direct form of political, economy, or social imperialism, that's what he argues, but there are also other forms of domination in which the thought processes, are dominated basically around knowledge production ecosystems. And presently, we see this, for instance, if we check kind of the curriculum that we're engaging with, the text, or some people call it the canon, theories that we use, the methods that we use, somehow we see them that they're actually coming from the Western world. Again, you see who tends to be cited more and who tends to publish where, in which journals, which are highly kind of cited or ranked. We can see that indeed their kind of political trajectories influencing these knowledge production processes. And Alatas argues that we see this kind of imperialism in various forms, or it manifests itself in various forms. And some of them really is about exploitation, where data is collected from certain places, or we still use what they call informants, or in most cases, research assistants. And then it's taken from these places, it's brought to Europe, it's processed, theorization happens here in Europe. And then again, kind of that continuous process of knowledge production in which certain places really are seen as labs, where you just go and experiment, you come here, you do actually the entire knowledge production processes here. And of course, the West is kind of at the center of that. And presently, we see it particularly around global flow, social scientific knowledge, where in the past, indeed, there was this kind of direct control of universities, but now it's more about controlling the social scientific processes of knowledge production. Of course, I can spend the whole day talking about this, but let me kind of straight away run to my interesting BT on China and Africa, which I think we are all gathered here for. I think when we go back in time, let's say from the early 2000s, if we are to randomly go do a Google search, a Google Scholar search, and try to see who is kind of published on China, Africa at the moment, you can see that probably you have probably 3-4 million hits in a given 30 seconds. And chances are you're going to see most of the stuff coming from Western established scholars and stuff like that. And because of that, we can even see the narratives that have kind of come with that. For instance, if you go to economists and kind of other world-leading newspapers and journals, you still see this idea of the West kind of shaping the narrative around how China should be engaging with Africa, or how Africa should be engaging with China. And in most cases, it comes from a perspective of the other having kind of a moral imperative of a higher ground of some sort. And they kind of position themselves as having a higher moral ground and authority to think and believe what is best for Africa, for instance, and how then Africa should be engaging with China in that regard. And this is, in most cases, kind of takes Africa as without agents or without power to decide what is best for them and who they should be interacting with, so to say. As I said earlier on, you see kind of some interesting grabbing headlines, seeing China and scramble for Africa. You also see these headlines around China and kind of neo-colonial endeavor. And we also see kind of this very never dying horse here about Chinese loans and this kind of predatory loans and this debt trap diplomacy, because these are coming from a certain predisposition which sees certain places as not having the kind of the power and the means through which they can make their own kind of honest assessment of who is in their interest to engage with or not. I will not really spend much of my time here because I think we are all familiar with this kind of these perspectives and narratives, which kind of paint an image of seeing either China as kind of the bad guy in Africa, or seeing Africa as in not being in a position to think about themselves or who they should really be engaging with. And these narratives are reproduced time and again, and you start wondering, why do we have this kind of repetitive kind of narratives being reproduced time and again, all right? And at the heart of this, you see actually where the point I'm drawing here, that there is indeed politics driving these knowledge production processes. Again, if you want to be a bit practical about it, we also see in terms of research funding, gatekeeping mechanisms, where it's quite difficult for researchers based in Africa, for instance, to get access to research grants around maybe looking at different research topics, China and Africa being one of them. And again, we also see different forms, structural forms of gatekeeping, which kind of exclude or kind of bypass Africans, not as experts of their own place, but simply as informants or kind of research assistants, if you want. If you check most of the journals, again, we see very low acceptance rates of African writers on the topic in world-leading journals. In most cases, African scholars being considered as kind of not having kind of robust ways of conducting research. And I really like this expression where someone would say, in most cases, we are asked to provide more details than our counterparts in Europe when we are applying for research grants. And when we do have findings, we are always asked to contextualize our findings as if we have no idea of what we are talking about. And it's quite troubling to some extent as well, as this guy was saying, the parameters through which our research is judged, in most cases, the Western world is used as the kind of the yardstick of measuring how good or bad research is. I think I've already said this. So in terms of kind of the process, this is what we did. We went to Scopus and then we had we went to Scopus and then we had our kind of search words here. Of course, this is just a summary. I think I have about like maybe a paragraph of this kind of search word, which we entered at different times, trying to see what the output was when we entered into that. And we then yielded around 339 documents, of which 213 were journal articles, 71 book chapters, etc. And out of this, then we tried to understand in what formats or in what forms these were published in. As I said earlier on, so we had books, book chapters, articles, and review articles. Because the main reason is that we wanted to understand in which forms or in what format this scholarly work is being published in. And then we started also questioning or querying author institutional affiliation, because we also wanted to identify where these authors are actually located geographically. But of course, geographical location and institutional affiliation on their own sometimes might not give you a big picture of what you're looking at, because at times we've got authors who are multi-located or who are multi-affiliated. So we might have someone who's affiliated here in the UK, in the US, or in Africa. So sometimes this might actually distort your data set. And then we also wanted to establish, of course, we looked at articles which had a declared funder. So who was funding this kind of research as part of kind of our inclusion criteria. So these are preliminary results and still much work in progress. But generally, as I said, majority of our paper, of the articles that we found, at least are journal articles. And then in terms of the subject area, again, we see majority actually published in social sciences. In terms of kind of institutional affiliation, we can see here, we have some authors who are affiliated with some universities in South Africa, St. Andrews in UK, China, Nigeria, and South Africa as well. In terms of by geographic location, what we have also established is that we have some in China, in South Africa, in UK, and several others throughout the world. In terms of by funder, Of course, we can see the UK kind of taking the majority share here. But this is only with specific reference to ESRC. We also have some, of course, probably the numbers are below 10 or below 15, where we have funding coming from AHRC and UKRI in general, and other funding. For instance, you see someone saying University of Cambridge or University of, but of course, if you try to dig into that, you actually realize it's actually all coming from UKRI. And in terms of the journals where this is kind of heading into, you can see here per year with the third world quarterly kind of leading on this. Of course, we also have this, but if you check where this actually established, you begin also questioning why this is the case. And in terms of citation politics, which I'll not have time here to discuss about, but again, you would see that those journals, which are in most cases located in the global north, they tend to have more citation coverage compared to those in global south. And again, which means scholars in the global north are likely to have an added advantage, a comparative advantage, let me put it that way, in terms of accessing these journals. And this means that their work is likely to have more currents compared to those scholars who are in the global south. In terms of some consideration here, of course, there are some limitations. So our universe, particularly in this paper around the literature, is that which we got from Scopus, specifically for this period. So which means chances are there are other loads, millions of documents out there, but we haven't really included them in our sample size here. Linked to that, there are possible errors as well, which we have no control over, but this somehow does not really affect the argument that we are making in this paper. And an important observation that we made here is that most of African-based scholars, probably they do not have access to these global north-based scholars, which doesn't mean that they are not publishing. They are publishing, but chances are the journals in which they are publishing are also not curated in Scopus database. And again, there's also a language limitation here. We are only focusing on English. Africa, with 2,000 plus languages, chances are some of this scholarly work is published in different languages. However, as I said, I think this is the best shot we've got at the moment. Of course, some people will say, why are you not using Web of Science, Dimension, Google Scholar, etc., like that? But in terms of how they collect their bibliometric data, it's quite difficult for us to manipulate that for our ends. I hope I've invited you to ask many questions, like I also have, which I don't have answers to. But what is important, the point I'm driving home here is that the knowledge production ecosystem at the moment is skewed in favor of the West. Of course, this is a huge generalization. And it actually makes it difficult for other voices from other places to be heard and shape perspectives and narratives around China-Africa relations. I think that's it for now. And as I said, this is work in progress. I would appreciate your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. I think you were standing tall on the politics of knowledge generation. I think that's fantastic. So fantastic. Let's have a discussant, Dr. Van Zouw from SOAS University of London first. And it's a really interesting paper, and it's very relevant to the work that we've been doing recently. So I'll tell a bit more on that after we've heard the discussant. Over to you.
I think it's a very interesting paper. And then, like you said, it really opened the door for engagement and discussion and for very broad, but very, very important question. And I was given very short time period to prepare for my slides. So do excuse me if you find any grammar mistakes or whatsoever, but I try to elaborate a little bit more, and in order for us to really try to work on this paper and then work on this kinds of engagement and discussion. So basically, I think the nature of this research is to understand what existing literature or we say knowledge stock in this field. It's a very ambitious way always to start from a review in the relevant field, especially when we're looking to China and Africa relationship itself, that we will have lots of questions regarding what exactly you're talking about. It's just like when we come into this room, which corner we should actually try to find a person to engage the conversation, because I'm from IB, and then if I talk to someone from accounting and finance, then
even we use the same terminology, but we may talk different languages. So that's why I think it's very important to think about China engagement in Africa, or in general, China and Africa relationship. They already change the focus or the dynamics of the topic you want to actually explore. So I really like the idea about you use the politics of a knowledge production, because most of the time when we do literature review, we want to know what exactly the research questions they're doing. But here you try to understand, in certain kind of higher order about, who actually produced those kind of knowledge and what kinds of implications, that they can actually, help profilate the knowledge understanding of the topic. So I think this is a very ambitious, and this is very important by asking what knowledge is produced, and then by whom and with what political implication. This is certain kind of question mark, why we really need to know the political implications rather than, in a more general sense. So as a literature review, and I happen to publish a systematic literature review with an interdisciplinary perspective. And I think is my experience can really actually try to help you out or contribute to certain kinds of further discussion on how to really go ahead with your work in progress. So there are lots of keywords that you mentioned, but the question here is that, are they too broad, right? Especially when we draw you guys back about this kind of relationship between China and Africa. Are we talking about political relationship? We're talking about trade relationship. We're talking about these kinds of finance and trade and investment relationship. So there, and even cultural relationship that, the social science and the humanities scholars talking about. So there are different dimensions, different levels, and a different interaction in terms of the China and Africa relationship. So in that case, we have to really think about whether those kind of keywords really grasp the true meaning that you want to do, or you actually try to open door and then try to think, I want anything. Then in that case, you even need to be more delicate in terms of the selection of the keywords. Now, you did talk about that Scopus at the moment is the best one that you can get. But I think at this stage, because it's still working in progress, do not close your door, open a window up. Try to see whether Web of Science or other database or even particular journal outlets that really engage the conversation between China and Africa or Global South relationship, whether they really publish. So you always do certain kinds of match between this kind of extensive database and particular journal outlets, because this is the process of the data mining for literature review. And one more question is about, you also have different types of articles. Now, this is very interesting because normally when we do literature review, we tend to use the peer-reviewed articles because the book chapters or certain kinds of review articles, they do provide perspectives, but they may not be, on par when you especially go for the content analysis. This is exactly what you try to understand after collecting all this kind of descriptive information about literature. So I have the question about why you try to use the different types of articles in your review. But again, it backs to your fundamental question, to what extent you want to open this kind of a dialogue and try to understand the literature or try to understand production of the knowledge. Now, these are more detailed issues that we try to look into the next step. So fine-tune the scope of the review. Like I said, there are different disciplinary perspectives that can be looked into. And I'm so glad today, I do not seem I'm the alone person here because lots of topics I can resonate, even though from development studies perspective or even anthropological perspective, but we're actually looking at a core behavior of firm activities in Africa and in China. And I think, by bringing the different disciplinary understanding or literature really help us to understand particular topic, which we tend to talk to our own colleagues. But there's a greater room for everyone like today to engage the conversation and try to think about what kinds of theoretical perspectives that we do use. I had a conversation with Gabine before, is that when we're talking about network, people actually in IB talk network a lot. And then it's the same case as development studies when we're talking about institutions. right? So I think here is that you really need to think about, what kinds of disciplines that really help to build up a very, very substantial stock of knowledge at the moment. Yes, it's true. They might be quite westernized, but that's okay because it really helps us to understand, and that's the purpose of literature review. We review what has been done before, and we review what we can do afterwards. Now, then I mentioned about keywords, so this leads to you. Now, the paper selection criteria. You did mention in your preliminary results, there's certain kinds of journal outlets. And then from my very naive and very limited knowledge, I think they're more from the political economy perspective. But to open up, I think at this stage, you do have the luxury to look into a wider selection of the database and journals and to understand the different dimensions and even multiple dimensions and their linkages about this kinds of political, social, economic, and also even cultural aspects of the China and African relation. I'm quite surprised you didn't mention about systematic review by using the softwares because this is quite a sophisticated software we normally use. And I strongly recommend anyone who actually interested in doing literature review, especially our PhD students, try to look into the VOSviewer. And this actually helps you to really address your question about the clustering map. So talking about who are the leading authors, the leading organizations, and also the key knowledge topic, by doing this kinds of mapping. So this really helps you to provide a more visualized understanding of the topic and then try to connect the different dots about those kind of things. Now, what's the next? And what's the purpose of doing that? You really provide a very broad perspective about why you came to this research topic and why it's important, not just from scholarly inquiry, but also policy and political discussion, that why different practitioners, policymakers, scholars, and even, private sectors should engage the understanding of the importance of a dialogues and communication and collaborative work in this context. So this is pretty much how to take the stock of your discussion forward. So we have a theoretical perspective, is that you mentioned about there could be quite, fragmented, talking about and China-centric, or talking about African agency or gatekeeping. But I think it's very important to have this kind of clear scope perspective because it really depends on what kinds of interest you're talking about, right? So there is no one fit-to-a principle. So that's why it's very important and critical to think about what's the base and what kinds of overarching framework that we can try to understand. The last point is, I'm not quite sure about ecosystem. We do use the ecosystem so often, but it's really a fuzzy word. And I think in practice, it really requires public, private sectors to be collaborative. But I'll leave that for further discussion. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those comments. So there's now scope for some questions, and I'd like to go to Andy and then the lady there.
Thank you very much. These are important issues. Just a couple of comments. I've been editing a development economics journal for several years, and I've recently done a study of the publication experiences of authors based in low and middle income countries compared to high income countries. And you can imagine the results in terms of the patterns of desk rejections, the patterns of acceptance after review and things like that. So that's just a bit of analysis with data from the journal. The second comment I had, or really question I had, are not some of the tools you're using for this analysis got the same biases that you're talking about? The Scopus and Google Scholar and so on, don't they have inbuilt biases as well, which sort of mitigate against being able to find and give sufficient weight to outputs from poorer countries?
Thank you. And then lady.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I just wanted to ask, like maybe one is a comment as well, but I was wondering whether you've also looked at like the position of authorship, like where, let's say the first author is like Western based, and then do you have other authors and what time, is it frequent that they then kind of invert and so on? And also kind of echoing on that point on kind of rejection rates, but that data is obviously not publicly accessible. So, but it would be interesting to have, you know, sort of like top ranked journals and have a look at the institutional provenance of the scholars and whether there is a higher rejection rate, desk rejection and rejection after review for sort of Southern-based scholars. But I also wanted to kind of highlight, you know, when you were looking at kind of the colonial sort of narrative, then how it emerged. But one thing that I've been noticing in, you know, obviously reading China-Africa literature on the daily is also this kind of like very masculine way in which it's portrayed, right? All of this discussion of China penetrating Africa, or like all of this type of dynamics that in other disciplines, like in international relations, have been looked at. You know, if you think about the missiles with the pinup girls on top, like this type of, you know, and then you, on the other hand, you have this representation of Africa as passive, and in the way, in the language that is often used, even on The Economist, New York Times, you know, as kind of this feminine energy of just kind of lying there, you know, waiting for China in this case. So it kind of echoes the sort of dragon metaphor, and I was wondering whether that would be perhaps another avenue to look at when you're trying to kind of set the scene of the different type of perspectives. Yes, the kind of new colonial argument and how it's emerged, the African agency term, but I think there's definitely also a kind of like a very masculine representation of this relationship too.
Very interesting. Just to say that I had myself thinking about the same when Andy was talking about some practical experiences. I mean, I think in the politics of knowledge production, you have we were organizing this meeting that I mentioned at the start of the conference, which was around China's engagement in Africa, and this was actually. It emerged from discussion we had with JICA, which were the Japanese, and they tried to have an understanding of why DFID, the Development Agency, had a different approach to development compared to the Japanese. The Japanese were more infrastructure and economic development, and FCD or DFID at the time had much more emphasis on the social sectors, on governance, and so on. And they thought, why don't we have a discussion on China in Africa to get a bit of a better understanding of how Japanese aid can be understood a bit better, and they were sort of behind the organization of the meeting. The second instance, and you mentioned the ESRC, the Economic Social Research Council, and so we had at some point at ODI we were part of the DFID ESRC Growth Research Program, which were indeed we had 3 rounds of research funding, and I think there's also on the financial sector. It sits here with the Center for Global Finance, and there was also China-Africa relations, and there was a huge challenge because whilst the motivation of research was really clearly focused on low-income countries, so there was discussion a lot on growth in developed countries and emerging countries, not so much in low-income countries, then actually ensuring that there are low-income country researchers applying for the ESRC funding was really difficult, and it was really challenging. And of course, for perhaps 2 reasons: because the ESRC goes with research quality, and you need 5-star rating journals. That's almost the necessity to get into the funding machinery, as it were. If you don't have that, then you may not get through. And secondly, there's of course fixed cost of applying for research funding, and there's all these forms and so on, and these fixed costs can be huge, and the machinery in Western institutions are much more geared towards doing that, and I think that is a huge challenge. But we had discussions around how to encourage to incentivize the ESRC to engage much more with low-income countries. So how could that be done? But I think your paper results and your discussions, you probably also should bring them to the ESRC as well. I think to sort of say, well, I mean, yes, they've funded a lot of research on China, Africa, but there are also challenges with it, and I think they will be really receptive. I think to what this. You know, one quick question, and then we go to your answer.
Maybe try to mumble through what there's so many.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. One is on, have you considered looking at specific country relations? Because it looks like your keywords were mostly on Sino and then Africa as a continent. But if you were to look at a particular countries like Nigeria or South Africa, that might show some slightly different patterns in which scholars from that country might be looking at the issue, probably will reflect similar kinds of biases, but it would be interesting to see if that changes anything.
Right.
And then a policy question for us scholars based in the global north who are trying to sort of decolonize the way in which we do research, what would be some suggestions that you could identify as maybe first steps?
That's also a dinner conversation, but over you.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks. And I'm very happy because I think I managed to achieve what I wanted to do, which is to raise so many questions in you. And I can see actually that we are where I wanted to be. And I want to appreciate Joe for your comments on my paper. They are very, very important. But I think what is really important at the moment, what we are trying to do without having to write 20, 30, 40 papers is that at the moment, we just want to do a landscape analysis to see where the knowledge is coming from and where it is going. Of course, there is scope to, if you want to move into particular disciplines, so it could be international relations, international development, and I'm sure probably, at least from my own analysis, the results will not be that much different. All right. Yes, the scope is there that we can kind of narrow it into disciplines and focus particularly on that. But I think this is not our kind of initial objective at the moment. We just want to kind of have a broad overview of where things are at the moment. In terms of these keywords, the way we looked at it is that we tried to see if these keywords were listed either in the title, the abstract, and the keywords of that given article. So we tried to cover at least 3 areas, not just only the title. The idea is that at least if these keywords are mentioned in the abstract, the title, and the keyword section of that, then we kind of get a coverage of that. Of course, it has its own limitation because you then have a very, very big data set to deal with. But we don't really want to limit ourselves here. That's why we went large. Of course, yes, I agree with your comment in terms of not limiting ourselves on focusing on scopus. But I think with this kind of work, you need to start somewhere. And once, for instance, we have this scopus database, we clean it as we have done so far, then probably we can go into other databases like Dimension, Web of Science, and Google Scholar. But then the challenge we'll have then is that it requires more effort in terms of cleaning than it is at the moment with scopus. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. It is possible, but it's more work from our end. So I appreciate that comment. Which other question should I go with? Yes, Elisa, I mean, there are several other aspects that we've included here. For instance, issues of race, issues of gender. But at the moment, we kind of not looking into that. But yes, there's scope to focus on that. Maybe let me just pick a practical question for you. I think what we are calling for here is really more of like decolonizing knowledge production ecosystem, yeah. With the idea that there are certain voices that should be also part of shaping the narratives around this. You know, this is where we are heading with, and more of like equal partnership in research collaborations, right? And not just as research informants or research assistants. Of course, some are more structural, like for instance, with ESRC in terms of funding requirements, in terms and conditions. But is there a way we can start thinking about how can we go about to kind of bypass? But again, it's practically impossible at the moment, especially with UKRI funding.
Good. So we're going to discuss that further during.
Yeah, let's catch up for dinner. Have as many questions as you got, and then we take it from there.
Good. Thank you so much. So we now go to the final paper, and we promised that it will also be a very provocative paper. So some very interesting paper towards the end, which is really good. It sets us up for dinner. The paper is by Winslow, Robertson, and Léonce and it's called Owning Assets or Injecting Capital, Distinguishing between Chinese Foreign Direct Investment and Lending in African Countries. So over to you.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Winslow Robertson, and we are actually going to try and go through this as quickly as humanly possible. So I have practiced only for the 20-minute version, so I'm sorry for maybe being more rapid than I should be otherwise, but I do hope that this generates a provocative discussion. All right. So we are doctors, actually, so we don't listen to the program, but I want to point out that we defended a few months ago. So yes, thank you. I'm a postdoc at Léonce Business School. He's just made the wise decision to go into industry, and now he has his own consultancy. He is a brilliant machine learning AI scientist and also a quantitative social scientist. And this project actually came about because of 11 years worth of frustration with me as being a China-Africa management consultant. A lot of people use this word Chinese investment in Africa. And what ends up happening is once they hear that word investment, there's a whole constellation of things that happen after that word. And I'm going to map out how that matters. So first, let's talk about the title, owning assets or lending capital. So if some of you know Lena, she's tweeting about FOCAC, and she's talking about this $51 billion in Chinese funding. And of that $51 billion, about 10 is for investment. But if you look at another tweet that might be more prominent by Al Jazeera's English podcast, here's 50 billion, and all of it is investment, not 10. Okay, well, why does that matter? So a lot of you in this room are probably pretty knowledgeable at the role of FDI in something in the social sciences. And I'm not going to list these out, but there's a lot. However, much of this research seems to conflate almost all Chinese financial flows as investments or FDI. And we're going to tease out why that might be problematic and why that might actually matter for all of you if you are an academic or a policymaker or a practitioner. So, I mean, that's just research. But yes, this happens constantly. This happened just a few days ago about China's investments in Africa. Investment, investment, investment. So the first thing is, well, is this FDI or not? You have a $4 billion railway that some of you might be familiar with. But if you read in the article, you look at it, well, this is actually a Chinese contractor that's using a policy bank loan. Okay, well, some of you might be interested in attracting investment, like this gentleman right here who runs a biscuit factory in Nigeria. That's actual private investment that some of you have been advocating for. Or somebody, Kent Chen, who's manager of the Grand China Construction Materials, he set up his first factory in Nigeria in 2015. Actually, I wanted to come in 2014, but then Ebola broke out. If I had come that year, I think business would have been better. So these are examples of investment in the way academics, policymakers, and practitioners actually use the term. But that $4 billion railway loan might not be FDI. And in addition, let's look at the World Bank Group. Here's a huge block of text, but I'm just going to focus on this. So even in some of this research, they're talking about we're going to code investments in 25 sectors. This database captures the small and medium private firms investing in Africa. So small and medium private firms such as a biscuit factory in Nigeria, so an SME. Contrary to common perceptions, there are few projects in natural resource sectors. Now, here's the thing. Common perceptions might say all Chinese financial flows are investments. But actually, these natural resource projects aren't FDI. And yet, here's a document from the World Bank saying, oh, we might think these are FDI projects. Okay. So I'm saying FDI. Well, what does it mean? So it requires a level of ownership, at least 10% or more in assets, location, difference between host country and local internationalization and internalization. And then these three features, FDI, ownership, localization, and internalization, comprise the so-called OLI framework for understanding foreign direct investment by Frangton as a trade economist. One thing just to keep in mind, like that railway project, that's an engineering, procurement, construction contract. Do these projects count as FDI? No, they don't. So FDI doesn't include policy bank loans. And don't take my word for it. I'm just a humble postdoc. The actual United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which, sets some of these definitions that all of you use, says most of the financing of infrastructure development is not in FDI. And on top of that, the OECD agrees with that. And on top of that, the IMF agrees with that. So when I earlier asked a question about this OII definition of investment, this is where this comes from, because we've read all these definitions to specify whether that 4 billion railway that I demonstrated earlier would ever count as FDI in any of the data sets you use. So we decided to write a conceptual paper, not a deductive paper with hypothesis testing. So let's say you're interested in FDI. And this is, I think, what scholars, policymakers, practitioners want to study. This is what we're here for. But in the China-Africa context, loans are much more important than FDI. And that's generally what most people end up studying. They're not the same. They don't interact. They don't intersect. Now, sometimes you might want to try and study FDI, but are the data sets you're using incorporating that? All right. So we say, hey, what happens if we use more accurate data sets to empirically test the effect of Chinese FDI on one variable in Africa? So FDI we get from the Statistical Bulletin of China's Outward Foreign Direct Investment and the China-Africa Research Initiative, which you might have actually been involved in collecting this data, Yunan. And now it's migrated to the Boston University GPDC. We got loan information from SAIS-CARI and BU GDPC. We have capital expenditures from American Enterprise Institute's Global China Investment Tracker, which some of you might be familiar with in some of these papers. And notice it's not the same. And then finally, FDI net inflow from the World Bank. And before we get to the empirics, to illustrate what I'm talking about, if you look at FDI numbers, the FDI numbers are generally a lot less than the loan numbers. And so when Linda was saying, hey, China has the 5th most amount of FDI stock, it's because a lot of folks are making maybe a category error in how they use this language of investment, because a lot of people are really interested in the Chinese loans, like the $4 billion railway, but they might not be as cognizant of that biscuit factory in Nigeria. But the biscuit factory is what most of us are actually generally interested in. And that $4 billion railway is a separate economic, not engagement, partnership, sorry. So, and keep in mind, this language exists in every discipline. So when I'm in management, when my colleagues say, oh, you're interested in Chinese investment in Africa. No. I'm interested in Chinese firm internationalization in Africa, because it's not investment. What if I'm dealing with an economist or a finance person? Well, I'm interested in Chinese capital flows or Chinese finance in general, but never investment, because investment, unless I know for a fact, has this equity requirement, I cannot make that claim. All right. Now, I'm just talking about this definition, but what does that mean in practicalities? And now we have a much more intelligent gentleman than me to finish this out.
Thank you, Winslow, for this presentation. So I've been pretty much interested in this paper. We've been covering this paper because I'm a Huawei alumnus. I started my career in the mid-20s in Côte d'Ivoire, building telco infrastructure for Huawei. And this is how I've been trained through the mindset, through the productivity and everything. And I've realized that I've got a lot of knowledge transfer from Huawei, but then talking with other people in the West, they're talking about Chinese involvement in Africa, and they're seeing that in a very bad lens. And my experience with Huawei has been very, very different. So we've been thinking, so working on this conceptual paper, but then we got this data set and we wanted to have with some numbers showing what could be the difference between FDI and loans. So from the policy perspective for the African countries receiving this financial commitment or financial engagement from China, want to disentangle the effect. So we are putting together a simple model. We are not looking for correlation. It's much more complicated than that. But we want to see the association between the GDP growth and first FDI flow, and we control for the for the amount of FDI stock, knowing that for some countries, if there's too much stock of FDI, perhaps the flow is not going to be positive. The impact is not going to be positive on the GDP, and we control for other factors such as the year, the country, and the country income group. For small income group or large income group, the effect might be different. So this is the control that we put here. So our baseline, we really want to make sure that the FDI flow has a positive impact on the GDP. And then having a very precise data set, we also look on the loan aspect, and we expect that the loan aspect is not necessarily going to have a positive impact on GDP. Because through the FDI flow, through the equity, there's knowledge transfer happening. They have several mechanisms through which the investor, the Chinese entity owning the asset, is pretty much interested into having the asset being productive. Whereas in loan, that might not necessarily being the case, because the loan provider has different mechanisms to make sure that he gets back his money. So there's not really channel to make sure that the investment is really productive. So in our empirical analysis, in our baseline, what we have here, we want to make sure that the FDI flow is positively associated with the GDP growth. So we see that this is the case. This is positive and statistically significant. So this is okay in terms of association. Very simple empirical analysis, very simple model. And then we add another variable, which is loan, and we see that this is negative. This is not statistically significant. And then basic analysis of correlation, we're seeing that, okay, FDI and loan are different in terms of the impact on the GDP growth. So the efficiency really matters. 1% increase in Chinese FDI is associated with 0.86% increase in GDP growth, and we see that with loan this is kind of different, and this is not statistically significant. So the definitions that we use in terms of Chinese finance, if we are not sure about the data set that we're using, it's pretty much important to be precise and talk about Chinese finance instead of talking about Chinese investment, because when we talk about investment, perhaps we immediately think about FDI, which might not be the case. So these are other examples of some Chinese investor, Chinese companies owning assets in Africa that are working and not necessarily looking for government contracts. And this is from my experience from Huawei, I could see that for some project that we have with the private sector, with telco companies, were pretty much efficient because the client was like really pushing us to be pretty much productive. But with project that we have with the government, that was not necessarily the case, right? And also looking at the other literature, not really the Chinese literature, but like there was a report from the French Parliament looking at the French companies in Africa, and the report was saying that the companies working in the English part, not the former colonies, were much more productive than the one relying on the French infrastructure in the former colonies, right? So this is gives a little bit of perspective, know that perhaps the companies looking to rely on the state apparatus, perhaps also there's incentive to seek rent, and they might not be really productive. And this might be also more complex than that, and this goes back also to the conversation that's been discussed about embeddedness and things like this, such as that FDI also might be really productive because the asset owner, in the case of SOE, rely on another investor that's really embedded within the infrastructure to make sure that from the beginning of investment, we also reap the rewards of the investment that we're making. So thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to the discussion and the feedback.
Right, thank you so much. That was the final paper. Let's turn to Sandra for the comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Léonce and Winslow, for this interesting paper. And I think that they have really well introduced the topic of their paper. So their concern about the paper is that they are just trying to look about how we can clearly understand the Chinese investment in Africa. So due to this, for sure, they have just tried during the paper, I just skipped that part. They have just tried during the paper to try to clarify what we mean by FDI and what we mean by loans, and what are the different main valuation that we can just relate to such kind of concepts. So due to this, I've just tried to just shorten and summarize the key aspect that they have just mentioned in their literature. And maybe for the other part that for me sounds as interesting is that I was just looking for some interesting aspect that could help to understand why is it so important to understand why we will have to distinguish between FDI and loans. Why is it so interesting for the African context? So first of all, about the literature, what they have just mentioned, and they have just tried to discuss, it is about all those confusion that we have around the concept of investment, Chinese investment. So they have just tried their best to gather several thoughts around this. And also about the data sources, as Winslow and Léonce mentioned, also the way the different institutions are just related and measure the Chinese investment in terms of volume. Sometimes they relate themselves as FDI, and other time they relate as loans. So we have some confusing in several reports about this part of Chinese investment. And also what they have just mentioned in the literature is the different financial instruments used to try to understand this Chinese investment part. And all other aspects that they have mentioned that sounds interesting and make also their paper interesting about the literature was about the role also of the policy banks. So the way the different banks, or maybe the way the different policy are just designed, encourage maybe more loans. And we raised this also in the morning. Which type of source of loans do we have? Is it a private one or a public one? So there is also a need of clarification about this, and they have just tried their best to mention this in the literature. We have also other aspects as agency problems and need to clarify also the terminology. So about this also, maybe I've just tried to pick out the different objectives. I've just shortened because by reading the paper, I've just mentioned for about 5 objectives. So I've just shortened and put here 3 objectives. That also show the importance for your paper, maybe to narrow and maybe clarify again a little bit the objective of the paper. So among the 5 ones, I've just picked 3 that sounds for me as important, is that you have to you are just engaged to clarify the distinction between FDI and lendings. For sure, you provide a more, or maybe you want to provide a more accurate measure about this part of FDI and loans, which is a huge and a big challenge is to really understand what could be the right indicator that could be used to really measure the FDI Chinese one and the loan one. So a big issue. And maybe the last objective that I've mentioned is how you want just to measure the impact of FDI and loans on the economic aspect that have just clearly, and you have announced this, as the GDP growth. So that was your engagement in your paper. So to improve the paper, for sure, for me, what the different aspects that I've just found out as the missing one that could also help to sustain your thought is that we haven't seen, or for my concern, I haven't seen a long-term development impact. So how those different funds, FDI and loans, can be considered, and how it could impact the economies of such kind of African countries. I've just clearly stated here some aspect that sounds interesting for the African countries as infrastructure, capacity buildings, or maybe the local job. because there is a matter there of transferring skills or maybe transfer of knowledge. So how can we consider if we could clearly separate and distinguish the different long-term impact? Also, the other impact that I was just expecting, because for investment, it is a long-term aspect also, as I've mentioned for the first one. So how those investments could shift in the future, because we are not expecting the African countries to remain dependent from the Chinese investment, right? So we try and we just expect in the long term that we can have a shifting behavior or maybe an hybrid model that I've mentioned here to have a reduction of the long-term, the FDI, and maybe an increasing of the local investment because of these transfers of skills and competencies. So another important aspect for me that I was just looking for is how the local industry is just trying to improve, because we have just trying to identify also the role played by FDI and the role played by the loan in this case. And for the last one, how can we consider the alternative financing model? So for the Chinese investment, for sure, it sounds really important, but we have other international institutions or maybe other countries that are just investing in Africa. And this morning also one intervenant mentioned the fact that Chinese sometimes in some aspect is the third, could be considered as the third investors, because we have other competing countries that are just investing in such kind of area. So how can we just balance the information and consider other investors and maybe other international companies, and what could be their role to help to understand also why it is really important to relate ourselves about FDI and loan and clarify those aspects. And for sure, to finish, I will close my thought with this, is just to try to help you also to improve your paper as a good and a qualitative one, because you have mentioned that it is a conceptual paper, but I think that you have to challenge a little bit if you want to reach a certain level of standard for publication. So due to this, I have just a little bit take out maybe the two main questions that are just appearing in your paper, but what I've just added here that could sound interesting as if you can just consider this. It is why it is so important for you, because you have just trying to help us to understand that FDI and loan, we have to clearly differentiate those two aspects for the Chinese investment. But the remaining question from my side is, why is it so important to have such kind of good clarification for the African context? And maybe also the second question about the economic growth that you have well related, and trying also to develop an estimation about this. Maybe because we have clearly split, or maybe you're trying to clearly split FDI and loans, what are the clear impact for each of them? Because you have shortly and well summarized your estimation by presenting the first model where we were just having FDI flow and stocks. And for the second model, you have just considered the two first one plus the loans. So we cannot clearly identify separately what is the impact of FDI and what is the impact of loan, and maybe and lastly, combine the two. So maybe it could be interesting also to find the good model that could be more appropriate to clearly distinguish those two impacts. And last comments, and I stop there. It is just for them. So for the last comments, you need to sustain the justification of your paper to more enrich the theoretical part, and maybe be a little bit aware about the way you are just phrasing or rephrasing, because we have a lot of rephrasing in your paper. Okay, so many thanks for this good paper.
For the thorough comments. Okay, so are there any quick questions to be had? So there's two gentlemen there, three, and then we go back to the authors.
Well, thank you very much.
We use the microphone, please.
Okay. So yes, in terms of FDI, I explained that we're using investments for finance, but not FDI. Of course, once we talk about FDI, they're talking about a 10% threshold, and then there's also management control. But apart from the investment or finance, it's also important to look at a certain feature of the local markets, because most of the studies that have looked at, let's say, FDI flows, tend to find that FDI does not really impact positively on growth. But when you interact with institution, the domestic financial market, then you begin to see the real impact. I did a study with one of my PhD students. We're looking at Chinese investment on poverty reduction. And interestingly, we found that the strength of institutions rather cause a positive effect of Chinese investment or Chinese FDI in reducing poverty. But the direct impact, we didn't see any significant result.
Right.
So you may want to consider.
That's very short.
Mine is very quick, but this is just out of curiosity and also ignorance. So rather than just distinguishing between these two, but is the does your data set capture lending for FDI? Is there anything like this kind of model? I mean, you lend for acquisition or flows. I mean, does it capture such hybrid animals? Yeah.
Yeah. So how is the FDI financed? Is it through reinvest? And the gentleman here, and then the final question. Good.
First, a comment and then a question. First, I like the discussion because especially when I've done FDI research, it is, which are you? Are you a macroeconomist, financial economist, or are you an international economist? So I think that one thing you should probably explore is probably making the first part much more of a theoretical paper, because there's a lot to discuss in the IPE literature that really goes into whether FDI flows are a macro financial phenomenon or are they related something specific to international business. So that might be something to explore because that's a rich kind of stuff that's happening. And I think that you should explore that. And then secondly, sort of to build up on the data that you have, maybe another way to refine is to look at the nature of the financial transactions much more granularly, because there are hybrid instruments, debt-like instruments or equity-like instruments, which of course could harden into FDI or harden out of FDI if that happens. And so that would actually be quite interesting to see, because no one's really explored the nature of those transactions in that kind of context.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay, Pia.
Not related to what Peter said. Did you check whether lagging one more just loans? So, when you studied loans, just add a longer lag, because potentially FDI is more closer to the market, so more closer to specific projects that are actually being built, while loans might actually come a bit later. So I would check for that.
Good, thank you. There's one question online. The last paper about the clear definition of FDI and loan concept is very interesting, particularly given examples of the Chinese firm that has invested in biscuit factory and the railway loan given to the Nigerian government, which doesn't really impact the Nigerian GDP. Permit me to ask, is this not the recolonization of Africa all over again? What's Africa doing to resist this? Right. I think this is a really interesting discussion around the concept of FDI versus loans. So the question about what is FDI, how is it being financed? FDI is on the balance of payments concept. It's not a national accounts concept. It's not a gross fixed capital formation. And there are lots of differences here. And people are sometimes confusing different things. But so some clarity is useful. So over to you for your final minute, perhaps each, and then we close the meeting.
Do you want to go first? Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you, Sandra, for your comments. First, so we have another session post this, so we're gonna discuss that further, because like your comments are so comprehensive. We're pretty sure that from the empirical side there are a lot of things to do, and also from the theoretical aspect, we are we are very well surprised and interested that our paper is getting many feedback, and we are sure that we have to work a lot on different aspects. So I'm not gonna get a lot into the details. For the last question or the penultimate question or comment about how do we position ourselves, if it's a more macro or macroeconomics or IB, we still need to decide. And one of the things is that most of the authors, we are outsiders. My PhD is in operations management and machine learning, is in more management OB, and Linda, our co-author, is more and more cognizant about that. So we really need to know more about this literature, and getting such feedback is very interesting for us. So we still need to make many decisions about how we're going to position our paper and move forward with that. And there's also the fact of getting a little bit more granular in the data to understand the mechanism. So we position our paper initially as a conceptual paper, and then we get the data, which is rich. So perhaps we also have to move to perhaps test hypothesis and understand a little bit more of the mechanism. If we have to do that in only one paper, you have to do that in 2 papers. So these are also decisions that we need to make, and we're pretty much aware of that, and we thank you for your comments. Regarding the other question of the interaction, to understand how FDI is having the channel through which FDI is having impact on the growth of the GDP. Thank you for your comments of mentioning the institutional political environment. We'll need to also have to look into the data. And we haven't looked at the aspect of where does the money for FDI comes from. This is an interesting question. We'll see. Yeah.
All right, super quickly. So yeah, thank you so much for the comments. Thank you so much for the really rich and fruitful discussion, for helping our paper. So we've already matched a data set that looks at basically 1,100 projects to loans, and some of these turn to FDI, but there's I can count them on a number of hands. In addition, just for everyone here, you should be very careful. We didn't show it. The China Global Investment Tracker, it's loans. It's not FDI. So if you work empirically on that, you might want to be a little more circumspect in your language about that. So just something to keep in mind. Well, we will definitely discuss lagging. We will definitely discuss how to position this as outsiders. And if anybody needs an amazing machine learning person, Léonce can just do it. So just to plug Léonce. And with that, we are done.
Thanks so much for the paper. And that brings this this day to an end. I thought it was a really rich discussion with 3 fantastic and diverse set of papers. I mean, China-Africa economic relations isn't just about economics. It's a very multidisciplinary issue, and so we're very glad that we could discuss all those dimensions.